President Trump and his administration is not new in wanting to paint a picture of unity in the administration.
It's not surprising in a way that we're starting to see more and more people be vocal, cross the aisle and vote with the Democrats.
This wishful thinking, let's say, from Democrats that perhaps President Trump is losing power is far too premature. Hey guys, how you doing?
Good. Bernie, you and I have matching plants today, it looks like. We're coordinating plants at least.
We do. I'm not at the White House today, so I at least have some green space around me.
Oh, lucky you. Yeah, it's really interesting what's going on in the White House this week after that Vanity Fair article. It's making for interesting chatter at all the various holiday parties that are still taking place around the town here. Who's in favour, who's out of favour? Shall we have a chat about that? Have a sort of deep dive into who might be on President Trump's holiday party list and who might not?
Yeah, it has been, let's say, the topic of conversation among many of the kind of political journalists here in DC, but also really the strategists that we talk to day in and day out on our programs. And the decision that went into having Susie Wiles speak on record with this journalist. And, if we look at, obviously, there's been much talk about the content of the article itself, but I think what is fascinating is we haven't had that type of insight into President Trump's inner circle. So, not just the advisors that we might see on camera from time to time, but Susie Wiles is someone who really never speaks to the public. She is notoriously shy. I remember after President Trump won the election and wanted to bring Susie Wiles up on stage to say a few words. She didn't want to, she was happier to be kind of behind the scenes. And now we have a better insight, not only from President Trump's chief of staff, who doesn't talk very openly very often, but also get a sense of how the president, how she sees some of the president's closest allies, from his vice president, J.D. Vance, to Elon Musk and the role that he played. And it does make for fascinating reading and gives us a bit of a sense of perhaps how things are developing now a year or so into President Trump's second term.
I suppose, just to be fair to Susie Wiles, we don't really ever hear from chiefs of staff either. Sure, we don't. I mean, generally they are the quiet person behind the scenes who, is really so busy. They're generally not a front of house spokesperson part of the administration.
I think that's part of the surprise here also, and that the chief of staff and Susie Wiles in particular, they're always kind of considered perhaps the quietest, most powerful role in the White House. And I think it kind of exposed kind of wider divisions that, we've had glimpses of, for example, about Elon Musk's work with Doge, for example, and foreign policy. But, we rarely hear it in that tone of people who were in the room on what those deliberations were like, which I think is also a sign of, how much more disciplined this Trump White House is than the last time, when kind of public disagreements were much more obvious to outside observers.
In fact, displays of public loyalty are sort of the flavor of this administration, aren't they? If we think back to those cabinet meetings that we've seen all year long, they generally start going around the table and each secretary sort of saying what a wonderful job the president has done and what they're working on and so on, which is not something that we would have been used to seeing at all in public with past administrations.
And also, it kind of, it was interesting because we've heard of rivalries, for example, or perhaps a budding rivalry between the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, thinking ahead to 2028. Fascinating to hear Marco Rubio say, well, if J.D. Vance announces he's running, I'll be the first person to endorse him and support him. And
well, that's what he says now, right?
That's what he says now, of course. And perhaps that message changes as time goes on. But I think also kind of the really stark portraits, and we haven't yet talked about the actual portraits of the members of President Trump's inner circle there, from his press secretary to J.D. Vance. But, beyond the visuals of it, President Trump and his administration is not new in wanting to paint a picture of unity in the administration. That, of course, is what all administrations want to do. But you do get the sense that in some of President Trump's more controversial policies, there was some discord, also from Susie Wiles herself, on, for example, the quote-unquote retribution campaign. And Susie Wiles saying we had a bit of a tacit agreement that after 90 days he would stop pursuing, more or less, his political opponents. And to hear that from the chief of staff gives you a sense that some of what has driven President Trump himself doesn't have the buy-in from some of his most important advisors.
I think also that's kind of indicative of how this White House operates, and that, they're ultimately the decision is his, whether it be about foreign policy or about domestic policy. Even if there are disagreements behind closed doors, ultimately people, at least the White House, does very much defer to him. We've had very little kind of public dissension. More broadly, though, I think, this highlights a bigger issue in which we've had perhaps more kind of dissension from other Republicans in the last few weeks and months than we had previously for the first, let's say, 9 or 10 months of this administration. I mean, I think the falling out with Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, is a good example. And you have Republican congressmen going on television and kind of warning against what they believe Trump's foreign policy will be. That's not something we really saw in the first 6 months of the administration.
And the first high profile person to leave sort of within the administration being the FBI Deputy Director, Dan Bongino. Obviously, he doesn't work in the White House as such, but in terms of, a very key appointment from President Trump, by this point in the first Trump administration, we'd seen quite a few personnel changes. And, Dan Bongino being one of those who was very, very vocal on his podcast before he was appointed to that role about the Epstein files, and, is quite critical of how things are being handled. And he was one of those who thought the files should be there and released on sort of the first day that they got into office, which was not the case. But I think it does speak to the unity that we've seen thus far, that he is the first very high profile person to leave in this way. And we should say he didn't say in his Twitter post that he was leaving over the Epstein files. He just wants to go back to his show, as the president put it.
I think the main question and concern for the White House going forward with Bongino would be, when he does go back to being kind of in the podcast world, whether he joins the podcasters such as Bannon, Tucker Carlson, even people like Laura Loomer, who are, broadly in favor of the president, but also quite willing to criticize him where they see fault. So, I mean, it'd be really interesting to see what Bongino, if anything, has to say about this administration once he's not constrained by the job.
One Republican strategist said to me that they felt he was going to be able to serve the administration even better on the outside. So, will we see him critical of the Epstein files? Who knows? But we may see him taking on some of those cracks that are showing in the MAGA world there, and be able to really intimately put forward President Trump's view on things, because he's been in the meetings, he's been in the room, he knows the direction that the president wants to take the rest of this administration.
And can speak more freely out of the administration in that sense. But I think when you speak about the Epstein files, that really, to me, that was the first instance of the real cracks showing in the MAGA coalition. We're talking about whether that coalition is splintering. Still, President Trump is incredibly powerful, incredibly popular among Republicans. But what we've seen, to your point, Brand, in the last few months in particular, starting with the DOJ releasing that memo back in the summer saying there is no Epstein list, you could start to see some of the threads pulling away. And I think that has accelerated, particularly in Congress in the last few months. And one of the reasons that we've heard is that members of Congress are simply frustrated. They have been largely sidelined by this administration that has been governing through executive order and hasn't turned to Congress for passing or for pursuing some of President Trump's agenda. But at the same time, it's not just that very public Marjorie Taylor Greene breakup, which has been quite astonishing to watch. It's the fact that you also had Republicans, again, using a discharge petition to bring a vote on extending healthcare subsidies. There is real concern. And I found it interesting that one of the more moderate, let's say, Republicans who pushed to have a vote on extending these subsidies, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, he said that conservative members of Congress, far more conservative than perhaps he is, had come up to him on the floor to say, I'm glad you're doing this because this is a real concern for us. But they feel they publicly cannot necessarily voice their support for such a discharge petition. Gives you a sense that especially on the question of cost of living after the election day. There are Republicans who have real concerns about perhaps where things are with the administration and decisions and policies that have been made, but don't know yet how to voice that.
And when you look at the polling numbers, for example, about Epstein, I think there's more swing than many observers kind of give credit for. I was looking at one poll from NPR and PBS that said that only 45% of Americans approve of how Trump handled the Epstein. Like that doesn't necessarily mean they disapprove, but it means there's certainly some question there. And if you look at polling more broadly of how Republicans see themselves, many of them don't necessarily see themselves as being MAGA Republicans. Many of them have been Republicans longer than that, pre 2016. And that number is actually dropping, according to most polls. The number that identify as the core MAGA Republicans, the many of them are newer Republicans, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would stay that way in the future. So I think, looking at the numbers, there must be some alarm bells ringing inside the Trump team that perhaps his grip on the base is less tight than many would have assumed following the election last year.
And I think those cracks over the Epstein files or how they were being handled started really just a few weeks into this administration. Like Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, said at one point, I have that list on my desk and I'm going to make it public. And then, months later said, oh no, there is no such list. And I have a very clear memory of being at the White House. Brent, I think you were standing beside me at the time, actually, because it was one of the foreign leader visits of all of these MAGA influencers and podcasters coming out of the West Wing carrying big binders that had Epstein files printed on them because they'd just been at a briefing in the White House and been given these so-called files. And then they all went home and looked at them. And several of them took to their shows later to say, there's nothing in these files, or they've been redacted, or it's information we already knew. And they were starting already to be a little bit critical of like, well, hang on, where are these files that we were told we were being given? And the fact that it has dragged on so long, I mean, almost basically the entirety of this first part of the president's administration, right, without there being any satisfactory answers there, has really not helped to shut that down or close that down. And it's been cast now correctly, I suppose, that this is an issue about the survivors and the victims and justice. So it's very hard to then argue against why would you be denying justice to people who've been so awfully wronged?
And it was interesting. I was recently speaking to one Republican who's kind of close to the White House, and he made the point that in some ways this is almost kind of a self-inflicted problem because Trump on the campaign trail very much promised transparency about the Epstein files. So, a failure to deliver that over 10 or 11 months kind of exposed that division over, the people who believe he promised one thing and now think he's maybe doing something else, and those who are willing to be a slightly more flexible in that regard. I think it's just an instance of promises meeting reality and, that meeting point being quite messy in practice.
That's one wedge, certainly, and I think that's been a really significant one for members of President Trump's MAGA coalition. I think in Congress and among Republican lawmakers, the economy has been the bigger wedge. I've been really surprised to see the number of Republican lawmakers we speak to in our programs, and I was speaking to one the other day who's in a leadership position, and they were talking about the very real impact. We've talked about farmers on this program before. We've talked about, the struggle of cost of living for housing and healthcare and many of kind of the big drivers of the cost of living. Republicans trusted President Trump on the economy over anything else. Of course, immigration was a driving factor in why President Trump was elected, but it was bringing down the cost of living. That was the number one reason. We remember that very well. And, if he hasn't yet delivered on that and says this will come next year with the tax breaks from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, there is a sense among the strategists and also lawmakers I've spoken to that it isn't necessarily something where the administration is going to win back some of these voters because these costs are hard to counteract. And I also found it really interesting to kind of see President Trump's message in his address to the nation, even though he's taken on board the fact that people might be frustrated with the economy at the moment. You could tell he's also frustrated by that frustration. He doesn't necessarily understand why people haven't accepted that his policies are better for the country or going to lead the country to a better place, specifically tariffs. So for me, that kind of economic wedge has been a far more difficult one for Republicans to square because that's the one that they have to sell to their voters.
I think from a communication standpoint, the issue this White House has with the economy and affordability in particular is that they've not really ever said with any clarity when it stops being Biden's economy and Biden's fault, and when, the responsibility falls with the Trump White House. In that televised address, there was quite a lot of mentions of Biden. I think he was mentioned 7 times, and wider blame was put on the Democrats for kind of lingering economic pain. But at some point, that messaging will stop working for many people who are perhaps on the fence or who were perhaps already feeling a little frustrated with how the first year of the administration has gone.
I think it's going to come down to as well where the economy is at come September, October of next year. Right now the Democrats are making great gains in messaging and in those few elections that we've seen because things are still really expensive. Yes, petrol has come down a bit, but groceries are still really high, energy is still really high, housing costs still really high, and so on. The cost of buying a car and buying those sort of big purchases still really high. So it's kind of easy for people to vote against that message now. I think when you're actually thinking about going to the polls next September, October, and then on ballot day in November, you might be there going, actually, things are a bit cheaper, or they're about the same, I'll give them another chance, or oh, they're still so expensive, that's the end of that. So I think he's realizing there's a bit of road there, and he's kind of backing himself if he can get out on the road, have these big rallies next year. Really bang those talking points and make a few changes to things, that it may not be as bad as some other Republican strategists are seeing it, and particularly those people who are in really tight districts, who are very, very nervous about their own seat. And, I think politicians the world over, right, will probably ultimately put their own survival ahead of anything else in terms of winning their seat is the most important thing that they need to do in that moment. So it's not surprising in a way that we're starting to see more and more people be vocal, cross the aisle and vote with the Democrats on issues that they're going to take home for this holiday season and be able to say, well, hey, I did what I tried, what I needed to do, and it wasn't my fault. It was the speaker's fault, or it was the rest of my colleagues' fault, and so on.
I think also, the Democrat strategists I've spoken to, they have started to say, especially after the election day in New Jersey and Virginia, the mayoral race in New York, although that was a bit different, they've started to say, oh, President Trump has reached the zenith of his power in the second term. It's all kind of downhill from now. He's lost power of over his coalition. That's, to me, grossly exaggerated. I mean, clearly President Trump still wields incredible power. I was watching a talk with congressman from Missouri who is in a leadership position in the Republican Party, and he was asked, "How will you try to put President Trump on the ticket so that people, turn out for the elections? And is that a boost or is it a negative with the way the economy is going?" And he said, "Bar none, it is a boost. He is a turnout machine. If he shows up in these districts and whips people up to vote." They will go out and vote, and they will go out and vote Republican. And so they clearly see, his power is still largely intact. And I thought in the NPR PBS Marist polling, which was largely a real warning sign for the president. I mean, the numbers there were pretty stark. 61% of Americans saying that the economy is not working well for them personally. If you look at the numbers for Republicans, there's only been a slight decline in President Trump's approval rating among those Republicans. So 84% down from 89% in November. They're still largely behind him. And what President Trump says and wants done in Congress will still largely dictate the agenda. So I think kind of this wishful thinking, let's say, from Democrats that perhaps President Trump is losing power is far too premature.
The other thing about that poll that I thought interesting was, in the past we've spoken about, for example, splits within the Democratic Party, the people that support AOC and Mamdani, for example, and the traditional Democrats. That poll suggested that there's a lot of room for that to happen in the Republican Party as well, with younger, newer Republicans being less tied to kind of the orthodox old school Republican side. And I think, if the economy or foreign policy becomes very divisive within the party, we might kind of see a similar split as we've seen with the Democrats.
And that point, Bernie, was actually borne out in a poll I was looking at from the Manhattan Institute, which is a conservative think tank. They did a poll a few weeks ago of 3,000 Republicans to find, kind of where people's views were heading into the midterms and beyond in terms of who might lead their party and so on. But they kind of broke down the survey respondents in terms of what they called core Republicans who had voted Republican always since 2016 or before, and then new entrant Republicans who are the younger Republicans or, have come to the party more recently. And of those, the core Republicans, 70% said they would definitely support a Republican in the 2026 congressional elections. The new entrant ones, the younger ones, or who've just recently come to the party because of President Trump largely, only 56% said that they would definitely support a Republican in next year's midterms. So that's the real pinch point, I think, for Republicans in terms of hanging on to the coalition that President Trump so successfully built. And that's the problem, isn't it? That sitting presidents have in all the midterms. That, people aren't as enthusiastic as they were for the presidential election, and generally the party out of power is much more energised and much more inclined and motivated to go in and vote against the other party. So I think, we always say, it'll come down to turnout. It really will next year, and I think we're going to see really serious get out the vote efforts on behalf of both parties.
It's how the president does that and how his team does that I'm going to be most interested in. For me, actually, the biggest, let's say, wake-up call for President Trump and his administration was actually the Indiana redistricting vote. Indiana is a deep red state, and the president and his team put real muscle into making sure that those senators passed his effort to redistrict in Indiana. And in the end, the result was not close. And what I found really fascinating, we spoke to one of the state senators who said from the get-go he was going to vote against, Mike Bohacek. And he said it was actually the president's language. He had referred to the Minnesota Governor Tim Walz using a slur. This senator said it was so offensive to him. He was already, very on the fence about the redistricting effort, but that kind of cemented his position. And indeed, afterwards, when you heard some of those state senators who voted against speaking to the media, they said it was those kind of almost bullying efforts to threaten Republicans there to vote in favor of redistricting that really backfired. And if you have in a state like Indiana, where the governor himself is under incredible pressure from the administration and isn't able to convince these Republicans, you wonder if that brings the entire tone and approach of the administration in question again, as we're seeing, a few people as well, Republicans, were not happy with the way the president posted about Rob Reiner, the legendary Hollywood director and actor. And it's unusual to see Fox News panelists kind of distance themselves from the president on some of his posts, but they did so there. And you wonder, tone is one thing and policy is another, but that really stuck out to me as kind of being an example of where something is not working, perhaps.
I'm not sure when people go to a ballot box that they vote at all on the tone or, the posturing of an individual. I do think, and we've seen this, haven't we? They really just vote on what does it mean for me and my family, my neighborhood, my town. I want a better life, and the whole point of politicians is to make life better for me. So what are they doing? But we will be obsessed with this in many ways next year. I think will be absolutely lots to talk about, as there is in our very special episode that comes up next week, our bumper holiday Christmas New Year's edition. We've got our Christmas jumpers and our Christmas ties on, so do tune in for that one. And yeah, talk to you soon, guys, I guess. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.